If a billionaire needs you to go to work so he can make billions, then the source of his billions was always you.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, author and digital rights advocate Cory Doctorow. And we're going to be talking to Cory in a moment about, among other things, his new book, Attack Surface, and about where his work intersects with economics, and also about the importance of the late, great anthropologist David Graeber, who, with his book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, got many of us thinking about money in a different way. The typical mainstream economics textbook story is that money is a system of tokens that evolved spontaneously through humans needing to solve the problem of barter, the inconvenience of having to wait for someone to come along who not only had what you wanted, but also wanted what you had, the so-called double coincidence of wants. And to solve the problem, humans started using tokens to represent value, starting with feathers and stones and beads and shells, and eventually settling on precious metals because you can make them into coins and they're hard to counterfeit. And because these are precious metals, at some point people preferred not to carry them around, but instead to lock them in vaults and issue paper IOUs for their precious metals. And then eventually people worked out that the system would work fine without the precious metals to back up the IOUs. So then we moved to pure fiat currencies. And then we worked out that we didn't even need to carry around the paper money. So now we just keep most of our currency tokens as ledger entries on a spreadsheet at an institution called a bank. And when we want to pay someone, we tell our bank to move some of our tokens from our name at our bank into another person's name at their bank by writing a check or swiping a card, and our respective banks change our ledger entries according to our instructions. All of which is a long story that comes to the conclusion that our present-day economies are still just barter economies, but with money, albeit getting more and more sophisticated, just serving as a device to remove frictions. So those big, shiny buildings in your capital city's finance district are just full of people just wanting to help us barter our sheep and our chickens and our credit default swaps in better ways. But David Graeber's book introduced us to what I understand to be a consensus among anthropologists, which is not only is there no evidence anywhere on Earth that money evolved from barter, but also that the way we do money today as a ledger system is the thing that came first, from as far back as thousands of years ago. And since then, we've alternated between ages of virtual and physical money, but with that money always issued and controlled by an authority of one kind or another, and never arrived at spontaneously by private sector actors. You may disagree with these findings, but if we put that to one side and bring things up to today, I think it's indisputable that when it comes to currency, there is always an issuer and a user. And if you find yourself subject to counterfeiting laws, you're probably in the latter category. Yes, private sector actors can always leverage a national currency by writing IOUs denominated in that nation's unit of account. But as I understand it, the only thing that can make those IOUs as liquid or as accepted as the national sovereign currency is when the currency issuer, the government, extends a legal franchise to that private sector entity to create those IOUs. And so in that respect, that entity is then acting as an agent of government. And so what many of us have found more useful in terms of explanatory power is the MMT money story, which starts with an authority like a nation state needing to get something done, whether it's to have an army or a national health service, and so it needs to provision itself. And so it picks a unit of account, a token that it alone is allowed to create, and this authority puts all the people under it in debt in that token. That could be done by issuing bills for fees or fines, but you and I are probably more used to this indebtedness showing up in the form of a tax bill. and by issuing tax liabilities payable in its own unit of account, a national government creates people looking to do things to earn its tokens, so that that government can then spend its otherwise worthless pieces of paper or ledger entries into existence to hire people to build its army or its healthcare system. So what does the government want when it issues us with tax liabilities? Well, it's a bit like that quote from marketing professor Theodore Levitt. People don't want a quarter-inch drill bit, they want a quarter-inch hole. The MMT analysis flips the script in a similar way. The government doesn't want your money, it wants what results from you needing its money, which is the ability to spend its currency into existence to provision itself. It wants the materials and the labor necessary to deliver the outcomes it was put in charge of delivering, like infrastructure or transport or security, maybe a public education system or a public health system if you're lucky enough to live in a society that values those things. But because resources are finite and fiat currency isn't, governments always stop short of supplying enough money to the economy to give everyone a job for 3 reasons. 1, they're scared of inflation. 2, it's very easy to get the unemployed to blame themselves for their own predicament. And 3, the volatility that arises from deepening social and economic inequality often benefits politicians running on a law and order platform. The MMT solution to some of these things is to have the government guarantee a job to anyone willing and able to work, which pays at a fixed and crucially socially inclusive wage. And this stabilizes prices by having the government only spend automatically where the spending is definitely needed, i.e. on people looking for a way to earn the government's currency who can't yet find one. Remember, the unemployment itself is a result of the government having a money system in the first place, but not running it optimally. So it's on them to fix it, and it's on us as voters to get that on the ballot. Also, consider that we already have a system where the government spends automatically via unemployment benefits when people become unemployed. And the government do this not out of altruism, but to stabilize the economy. So it seems to me adding an extra employment option to this stabilization mechanism doesn't take anything away, and it has to be better on a point of logic to what we have now. You can listen to our episodes 4 and 47 with Fidel Kaboub and Pavlina Chernova on how the job guarantee works as a superior macroeconomic stabilizer. It's likely that there will be challenges in the design and implementation of a job guarantee. And as Cory explores in his next book, The Lost Cause, what happens if, for instance, the people who wanted to make America great again but not in a way that works for everybody start lashing out in creative ways or trying to sabotage the system? And this question made me have a dig around and take a look at the early years of the NHS. And it turns out that when the NHS was at its planning stage, there were people who were worried about the government guaranteeing healthcare to everybody. People who didn't want the upper limit of their earnings to be decided by the state. And those people were doctors and members of the British Medical Association. And they published letters in the British Medical Journal describing Nye Bevan, the architect of the NHS, as a complete and uncontrolled dictator. And the doctors who were cooperating with the NHS were called quislings. One leading member of the British Medical Association said the NHS was the first step towards National Socialism, and that it would be controlled by a medical Führer. And this demonization of the NHS was also fun sport for the rich and prominent. Sir Bernard Docker, a CEO with an appetite for conspicuous consumption, who drove around in gold-plated cars and used his company to expense items such as a 14 grand mink coat for his wife. That's 130 grand in today's money. And also a Welsh castle. Yes, I really just said castle on expenses. Anyway, this Jeff Bezos of his day was so worried about everybody getting healthcare that he described the National Health Service as a mechanism in which the patient will get caught and mangled, and that it would result in the mass murder of hospitals. Baron Thomas Horder, a physician to Queen Elizabeth II and the president of the British Eugenics Society, warned in a speech to the Society of Individualists that if medicine were taken over by the state, it would be as disastrous as the domination by the church in the Middle Ages. And in fact, a greater disaster because the church was cultured. And this was not popular pushback. This was just a tiny sliver of privileged people leveraging their positions. But as a result, compromises were made and general practitioner surgeries were kept as private businesses and senior doctors in hospitals were allowed to continue private treatment, which preserved the private healthcare system. So right up to the present day, even in the NHS-loving UK, we have a two-tier healthcare system where if you have more money, you get better healthcare. So we're still distributing healthcare by income rather than need. But just because that was and still is massively unjust, as I see it, I still think we needed to institute the NHS and carry on instituting it today. If you'd have asked the advocates and architects of the NHS to guarantee that it would be constructed perfectly as a qualification for its inception, it would never have gotten off the ground. But maybe that's the whole point of asking for proof of something that's impossible to prove. So when it comes to the job guarantee, I think we have to proceed on the basis that it might not be implemented perfectly, but perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good. And this brings us back to the importance of understanding how modern money systems work in macro terms. When you have a floating exchange rate fiat currency system, there are only two choices for price stability: an unemployed buffer stock or an employed buffer stock. And as I said before, I choose the second one because it seems to me better on a point of logic than the first one. In the interview, Cory raises a point made by law professor James Boyle, that until the concept of ecology came along, a lot of people were split between different fights. People who cared about animal rights, people who cared about habitat, people who cared about pollution. But with the advent of ecology, this became one movement with 1,000 ways to get involved. And I see a similar thing with the fight for a true full employment, socially inclusive job guarantee. At the moment, we've got many movements spread over many workplaces fighting for a minimum wage or better workplace safety, or for provision of healthcare to help working families, or for green jobs, or for localism, and on and on. And I think all of these fights can be brought together by the fight for a job guarantee. I think we might be at the stage in the job guarantee's history that the NHS was at in the 1930s. We need to keep making the case for it until it becomes not just the moral thing to do, but also the common sense thing to do. Anyway, I've linked to a ton of great stuff in the show notes, including more detail on the job guarantee from its principal architects, and also where you can contribute to Cory's Kickstarter for his audiobook, and also Cory's podcast, where there's always great stuff. At the moment, there's a 3-hour excerpt from his new audiobook, and also he's been reading one of his earlier novels as a series. So definitely check that out. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Your support really helps keep the show going and puts food on the table and is so appreciated. Support starts at $1 a month, which is 79 British pence at the time of recording. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all our shows and patron-only episodes. As ever, thanks for the time you put into understanding and spreading the word about MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And it's our pleasure to welcome back to the show the first MMT science fiction writer before Kim Stanley Robinson got in on the act, just totally copied him. It's Cory Doctorow. Welcome back, Cory.
Thank you. Although, I am but an egg and learned all of my praxis at the knee of Stan Robinson. So, all hail Stan.
Oh, yeah, you have to say that. We can be a bit more crude about it. First things first, let's get straight into the serious stuff.
Okay.
Emojis, Cory.
Yeah. Just one a day.
I feel betrayed. Pictorial Tom Swifties. One every day.
Just one a day. You're talking about my mailing list. I have a website called Pluralistic, and I have a mailing list called HaHa the Pluralist. And it's generated by a little script every day, but from like a master file that I write every morning. But I needed a way to put bullet points in, and I was like, this looks very dull and gray, this mailing list, because I don't use any HTML in it, because you can hide all kinds of mischief in HTML. You can put tracking beacons and bad links and so on. So there's no HTML. It's all plain text, and it is a bit of a wall of text. I was like, it needs something to enliven it. I will put in one emoji every day, and I will invite readers to suggest emojis for the next day. This has only happened once. I've been doing this since January, and only one reader has been like, yeah. Well, it goes to show you that there are some configurable elements, although I'm a big fan of configurability, some configurable elements that no one cares about except me.
But I'm just, as sure as marijuana leads to heroin, you're going to be.
Emojis leads to emoticons leads to
what about GIFs? Are we good?
GIFs? Oh, you're a woman after my own heart. GIF, thank you.
It is GIF.
That is the hill I will die on all day long. After all, it's the giraffic interchange format from CompuServe, right?
Yes,
right.
That's
exactly
absolutely
what.
Yes.
That's why I did it. Obviously,
everybody knows.
Everybody knows that back in the days of CompuServe, we pronounced the word graphic giraffic, and that's where we got Jurassic Park from. And when they needed a way to interchange files, they patented this file format, the giraffic interchange format.
I mean, I knew that. I was just checking that you did. That's cool.
I mean, that's just a fact.
Yeah. And look, anyway, I had this idea for, betraying us all with your emojis or emojis.
Emoji, absolutely.
I thought as a penance, you should be made to write your next 5 articles on parchment with a quill, have them delivered by carrier pigeon. But then I discovered today that that's nearly one of the pledge levels on your Kickstarter, isn't it?
Yeah.
You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, my hand is cramping just thinking about it. My third Little Brother novel is coming out in October 1st in the UK, October the 13th in the US. And so the first 2 were young adult novels. They were these New York Times bestsellers. And the third one's coming out from Macmillan and How to Zeus in the UK. But neither of them picked up the audio rights because I won't sell my books with digital rights management, with copyright locks on it. And Audible, which controls 90% of the market and is a division of Amazon, won't carry my books because they don't have DRM on them. And so none of them were interested in paying me to market a product where they had to forego 90% of the market. This is not an indictment of them. They're not charities after all. So I decided I would commission my own audiobook. Luckily, I live in California, in Los Angeles. I was able to use the same studio that we use for my commercial audiobooks, the same voice actors. Literally, the woman who read it also read on my last one. Her name is Amber Benson. You might know her as Tara from Buffy. I use the same director, use the same mastering process, and I've put it up on Kickstarter. And the idea is that if I can just sell a metric crapload of audiobooks, and I'm also pre-selling the ebooks, although those aren't independently produced. Those are on behalf of my publisher. So I'm just taking the share that Amazon would normally get for those pre-orders, and then I remit the rest to the publishers, and then they give me back a royalty. But if I can sell a really large number of units, sort of 10 to 30,000 units, there will be space in publishing from now on for at least some authors to say, my audiobooks are Audible exclusive. That is to say, they are exclusive of Audible. You can get them anywhere except Audible, and we are going to make up the bulk by pre-selling them in this person-to-person way, using a lot of hustle and elbow grease. I'm sending a lot of DMs and emails. I have a folder with 14,000 fan emails about Little Brother that from 2008 until today. And I'm literally replying to them one at a time and saying, hey, I have this Kickstarter that you might want to go and check out or tell your friends about, like Ringo Starr in that Simpsons episode. So that kind of auctorial elbow grease. And if we do that, I don't think we can use individual collective action to get at a monopoly capitalism. It's like using recycling to get at a climate change. But I do think we can whittle away at it, right? We can at least make a normative shift where people might ask, why are these books on Audible restricted and locked to Amazon's platform using this technology that's a felony to remove, and where you could literally go to jail for 5 years for playing these audiobooks on a non-Amazon approved player? And then maybe that opens the space for real policy interventions, for legal interventions. The German Congress today introduced draft legislation that makes interoperability, or rather the deliberate frustrating of interoperability, a cause of action for regulators to intervene in markets. So, if there's a bunch of people going, I want interoperable audiobooks, just like I have interoperable socks that I can wear with any shoes, why should the company that sells me the audiobook tell me what player I can use? Then maybe that makes that kind of legislation the kind of thing that gets through the Congress, right? And then we start to see actual changes.
Can we just back up a little bit and just talk about your opposition to DRM, digital rights management?
Yeah.
Just walk us through what that's grounded in.
Sure. Well, it started as like a fight about what are sometimes called like flexibilities in copyright. In the UK, they call them fair dealing, and in the US, they call it fair use. But it's basically all the things you're allowed to do with copyright under statute that technology prevents you from doing. So copyright and free speech are a little funny bedfellows, if you think about it, because on the one hand, you have, at least in the US, a First Amendment that says Congress will make no law abridging freedom of speech. And on the other hand, you have a copyright law where Congress hands out these monopolies to people who fix a creative work in a tangible medium that says no one can utter this work. Once you've written the words down, only you can utter them. So here's this law that just on its face, abridges freedom of speech. And the safety valve that stops that from unduly gnawing away at our human rights, at free expression and open discourse, are these flexibilities. And they're necessarily very qualitative, right? Like in the US, judges have to ask themselves questions like, is this a transformative use for a critical purpose? Does it unduly interfere with the market for the work? And so on and so on. These are not firm quantitative questions, they're qualitative ones. But computer scientists and I think most economists have this really unpleasant thing that they do when they have a problem they need to solve that has this irreducible qualitative element, which is that they vaporize the qualitative part and leave behind this like quantitative residue of unknown value, right? So you see this with like contact tracing. There's just this university that reopened where they got physicists to model the likely spread, and they built this model, and the model predicted that no more than 100 people would get it in a worst-case scenario, and a week later they had 750 active cases and put the university in lockdown. And it was because they just ignored the possibility that college students might get drunk and have eyeball-licking parties, right? Because quantifying the probability of college students getting drunk and being unwise is hard, so they just decided it didn't matter. They liked a perfectly spherical cow of uniform density on a frictionless surface and not, to deal with the friction coefficients of the cow shit that would naturally emerge, right? And so you have this software that does stuff like reaches into your world and says, okay, if you cut up to 3 seconds, that's fair dealing. If you cut 4 seconds, it's not. And that's just not how it works. Right? There are some times where it's lawful to reproduce the entire work, and sometimes where even the smallest clip would not qualify for fair use. It might be de minimis, which means too small for the law to deal with. And so that's where I started. But this law that says that it's a felony to traffic in a device that removes digital rights management was a moral hazard that tempted firms, because they quickly realized that if you designed any product that had software in it, which is to say all products, so that you had to remove a software lock, a copyright lock, to do a thing that displeased the shareholders, that displeasing the shareholders would become a felony, right? That you could get like felony contempt of business model. And so now we have ventilators where in order to swap there's the workhorse ventilator comes from a company called Medtronic. And to swap a screen from a Medtronic ventilator that's dead into a working Medtronic ventilator with a busted screen, you need to do what's called a synchronization operation, which is just a key exchange. And the only reason it's there is to stop independent technicians from refurbishing Medtronic devices, which is ironic because Medtronic started as an independent repair shop until it became a giant business and one of the world's worst tax evaders. But, that was just a grift before the plague. But now that you can't actually get a technician to fix your ventilator, and we need a lot of ventilators, that is a lot worse than a grift. And so the use of these locks to script our conduct to this very fine degree in a way that echoes, the company store, right? The company town where you slept in a company bed and shopped at the company store using company script, but which has this other characteristic of software, which is that it has this monotonic capability of enforcement, right? Where like if you were a miner in a company town being paid in company script, maybe you could buy a lot of corn at the company store and trade them for US greenbacks at the local moonshiner. But, once you've got DRM in it, it can tell what you're doing with it. It watches with this unblinking eye. So, DVB, which makes digital television standards for European TV, as well as parts of Central and Latin America, parts of Asia and Australia, they have a digital rights management that's supposed to limit sharing to one family. And then I was in the meetings where they hammered this out. I was like the opponent of it. And the meetings were a bunch of white guys from the global north, except for the Japanese representative. And they were all wealthy. And they made sure that you could have a family definition that was expansive enough that if you had like a houseboat and a country home in France, that your video would play seamlessly across them. But what they don't accommodate is like a Filipino family whose daughter is a nurse in Texas and whose son is doing construction in Qatar. There are a lot more families that look like that than have houseboats and summer houses in France. And because it's a felony to remove the digital lock, the definition of the family that is embedded in this stupid software designed by a bunch of rich white guys in a distant boardroom, mostly in Geneva, where the Digital Video Broadcasters Forum is, ends up having the force of law, right? What your family court or what your national law says your family is doesn't matter, because removing the technology to affect that definition is a felony. And so this is this incredible incursion into our basic human liberty, the combination of restrictive technology and law that prohibits its removal or tampering is in combination this toxic mess that actually gets worse because if you find a defect in one of these technologies, right? Like if you've got an insulin pump that has a digital lock on it so that it will only work with the manufacturer's continuous glucose monitor, the way Abbott Labs does, one other med tech giant, and you discover a vulnerability, as has been repeatedly discovered in these insulin pumps, that allows someone to wirelessly hijack them and dump the entire load of insulin at once, which is a lethal risk, right? From like 30 feet away. Publishing that defect, to the extent that that defect also helps people remove the digital rights management, is itself a felony. And so now firms get to decide who can disclose defects in their products, right? So you have in this one technology and law, a system that enables firms to control the conduct of their competitors, their customers, and their critics. It is a recipe for oligarchy.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, that brings us on to why we really wanted to talk to you today. Your third little brother book is coming out very soon. I ate it up like I did the first two. I loved it. Do you want to tell our listeners about the little brother world and then give us the setup for Attack Surface?
Sure. Yeah, after that giant rant, I'm sorry, I do get a little ranty, and I have drunk enough coffee to kill a rhino because I'm in a...
No, rant away. Rant away, my friend.
So, Little Brother and Homeland, its sequel, they're techno-thrillers aimed at young adults, although adults enjoy them as well. They're on the curriculum at like West Point Cyber Institute, and they're taught in a lot of university courses and so on. They're novels about young people in San Francisco who, after a terrorist attack that blows up the Bay Bridge, discover that as bad as it is to be the resident of a city that's victimized by terrorists, the police response, the military response afterwards, the transformation of your society into a police state is even more ghastly because it's your own people doing it. And unlike a terrorist attack, it doesn't end, right? Here we are 19 years, almost to the day since 9/11. And almost none of those restrictions have been relaxed. In fact, most of them have been increased in the generations since our last defining event that instituted mass surveillance. And so they make war on the Department of Homeland Security. They build these cryptographically secured wireless networks by hacking Xboxes, and they use them to coordinate guerrilla tactics that eventually kick the DHS out of San Francisco and restore the protections of the Bill of Rights to Californians in the first book. And in the second book, the protagonist, Marcus, comes into possession of a thumb drive full of leaks, Wiki-style, Cablegate-style leaks, which he then has to coordinate disclosure of, and which ends up being critical to an election and also exposes the connection between military surveillance contractors who are private sector and human rights abuses around the world. And so that's the first two books. The last one came out in 2013. Its major claim to fame is that if you watch the Ed Snowden documentary, the one that won the Academy Award, Citizen4 by Laura Poitras, you can see Snowden has a copy of that book with him in Hong Kong. And as he's fleeing his hotel room and jamming everything into his go bag, he grabs a copy of Homeland and sticks it in his bag. And Ed was kind enough to write an introduction to a new edition of those two books that just came out from Macmillan. And, you know, it was quite a moment for me to see that. But the third book, it's been 7 years, and it is a book that is really targeted at adults who grew up with those first two books. Everywhere I go, I meet people involved on the good side of computer security, people who want to give others more freedom, more self-determination, and more control over their devices. They want to protect them from invasive states, invasive corporations, from systemic discrimination, and so on. And they tell me that their start was reading Little Brother and Homeland. Cyber lawyers, privacy experts, computer programmers, security auditors, and so on. And this book is aimed at a different kind of technologist. This book is aimed at what I think of as the incipient Oppenheimers. It's a story about the young woman who appears in the beginning and the end of the other two Little Brother books, who is this very conflicted surveillance operative. In the first book, she works for the Department of Homeland Security. By the second book, her boss has taken her to Iraq to work for a private sector contractor, loosely modeled on companies like Palantir and the NSO Group. And she is having a reckoning with her life's work. She has gotten very wealthy and had quite a luxurious life, first hunting insurgents in Iraq and then helping post-Soviet dictators put down pro-democracy movements. But now she's come back to Oakland, California, where her childhood best friend has become a Black Lives Matter activist, and where she is being targeted with the very same cyber weapons that this character, Masha, helped develop. And all over the world today, technologists are waking up and saying, we shouldn't be building this stuff. Wow. Right? The 20,000 Googlers walked off the job in 2019 in an unprecedented strike. And there's a funny thing about tech workers is that they are less fungible, right? They're not more valuable, but they are less fungible than other kinds of workers. Their work hasn't been de-skilled to the extent that other kinds of work has. There are some AI experts, machine learning experts, that if they decide not to build a thing, it might just not get built. And, Oppenheimer famously was that person, right? He built the bomb. He had all these key insights that made the bomb possible. He ran the Los Alamos Manhattan Project. And then the bomb goes off, and he starts quoting the Bhagavad Gita, I'm become death, right? And he spent the rest of his life regretting what he'd done. He told Harry Truman when he was called in for a triumphant audience with the president, he said, "Sir, I feel I have blood on my hands." And Truman threw him out of the office and told an aide, "Don't let that son of a bitch ever get inside the White House again," right? So I would like our next generation of Oppenheimers to down their tools before they build the bomb. And this is a book about someone confronting the reality of what they've done. It's a techno thriller. Like the first two books, it's super technologically rigorous. All the machine learning stuff, all the security stuff, all the countermeasures, they're all grounded in what's really happening in the field. But her experience of them is a lot less triumphant than the insurgents who are the characters, the protagonists of the other ones. She is starting to realize that what she's done has left an indelible stain on her life, and that there's nothing she can do to fix it, right? That she is forever the person who built this. She can devote the rest of her life to making things better for people, but she will always be the person who made things worse for people. And it's my hope that over the next 10 years, I will meet technologists who will say, I sat down to read your cracking techno-thriller yarn, but I came away from it reconsidering my life's work the way I have so far. And it did turn me into an early onset Oppenheimer, someone who put down the tools before it was necessary to start quoting the Bhagavad Gita.
I'm really glad that you brought up Oppenheimer, because in my mind, you're linked to Kurt Vonnegut in your political conscience and what you want to do with your work. And I was thinking this is another link between you and him. Like Kurt Vonnegut is kind of often discussing, now we've invented the means to make ourselves extinct, what next? He was talking about nuclear weapons at that time. The idea is we've come up with these things in the name of pure science, and the tech is outpacing the ethical framework that we've developed. We don't even know how to talk about this yet. So, like nuclear weapons, you've got this apparatus of mass connection, the internet. It's also an apparatus of mass surveillance and mass influence. So I'm saying if people with very few resources could use this tech to convince people that, say, Hillary Clinton's running a paedophile ring in the basement of a pizza parlor and get somebody to go and shoot it up and kill people, that's small fry compared to the consequences of all the climate change denialism that this connection machines managed to foster, or COVID denialism, or the racism's not real type of denialism.
Or just sheer confusion, right?
Yeah.
I understand. We've always had misinformation. I don't think that's a new thing to our age. But it's just at this point, people are so divided just merely on the notion of reality, what is actually happening and what is real and what isn't. It seems like never before we've had to kind of debate just on that base level.
Yeah.
And something that you put in the book, Cory, about disinformation, it's not there to just misinform people. It's there to make people give up. That's something that Marcia says to one of the protagonists. It's there because we just don't know what's real anymore.
Yeah.
I just wondered what your thoughts were about, like, what's the heuristic or for how do we build trust? How do we go about pursuing trust?
Yeah, I mean, Patricia, I think you really put your finger on it there. Like, we don't have a crisis about belief so much as we have a crisis about epistemology, right? Like, not what's true, but how do you know it's true? And, we've all encountered this, right? I say that climate change is real. You say it isn't. I quote some experts. You tell me those experts aren't trustworthy. And we cannot agree on a common ground by which we would adjudicate contradictory claims. And, the Enlightenment was really a mechanism for replacing the kind of fiat version, of we do what the priest says, we do what the king says, with an empirical version that had checks and balances in it. And the idea was that if you pluralized power, right, if you forced people to reckon with the criticism of their enemies, not just their friends, right, adversarial peer review, that you would sharpen their ideas, that the self-deception that every one of us is prone to engaging in, and that our friends sometimes let us get away with, would be obliterated by having to defend your ideas to your enemies. And I think that the way that got formalized was through institutions that did truth-seeking, right? Regulators, where I show up and I say, this structural steel is of sufficient grade to put an RSJ in and keep this atrium from falling down. And you show up and you say no. And the regulator sits between us and adjudicates those two claims. And they're an expert and they recuse themselves if they have a conflict of interest. And they show their working and they have a process for reviewing their findings. So they publish their findings. They have a process for reviewing it later if new facts come to light and so on. And that process has been in decline for the whole neoliberal era, that market concentration allows for easy formation of a consensus position within an industry. Like, everyone who works in PE agrees that they can outperform the S&P 500, even though none of them do, right? And so when they show up at the regulator and they say, like, you should let pension pots be added to private equity funds, even though, our like 2 and 20 actually, when you calculate all the fees, looks like 65% of the gross takings, then the regulator who, in an industry that concentrated, the regulator is almost always going to be someone from the executive suite of one of those firms, because who else understands them well enough to regulate them is going to say, well, lads, that sounds about right to me. After all, it's what we were talking about last week at the club. And, here we go. And so, when people show up and they say COVID's not real and you ask them why, and they tell you, well, I don't trust the experts, and you ask them why they don't trust the experts, one of the things they'll probably say is, well, I don't trust the experts because they told us opioids were safe. And they did, right? They told us opioids were safe. Opioids were never safe, and it was obvious they weren't safe. The entire edifice of scholarship on opioids was built out of this, one of the most highly cited articles in history. It was a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine. It was called the Jick letter. It was written by a doctor at Boston University, Dr. Jick. 5-sentence letter. They call it the most consequential 5 sentences in medical literary history. And he said, I observe that my patients don't become addicted at the rate we predict from the literature, and I think more investigation is needed. And when you follow the citations to the everybody should take as much oxy as possible with, washed back with hot lashings of fentanyl, it all goes back to this one stupid letter that is in no way should have fooled any regulator who was paying attention. And if they were paying attention and they were fooled, then you know that they didn't give a shit. And so when someone says to you, I don't believe in COVID because the regulators don't care if we live or die, there is a sense in which they're not wrong, right? The conclusion is wrong. And how you sort the claim, like you go down to your Harley Street doctor, and your Harley Street doctor says, I'm going to give you some vaccines because they're safe. And then you go to the Harley Street doctor the next week and they say, I'm going to give you some opioids because they're safe. how do you know when you should believe your doctor? Right? And how do you know when your doctor isn't? Like, how do you adjudicate those claims? Do you go and get like a epidemiological degree, learn some cell biology, acquire the statistical nous to parse out the claims in the literature, get the media literacy to look at the citation analysis to figure out that there's JIC letters at the core of all of it? Or do you just find a community who sounds like they know what they're talking about and just trust them because you're in an epistemological void where these complex technological questions, should I get in a Boeing 737? Should my kid go to school in person? Should I wear a mask? Should I not wear a mask? Is it safe to go on holiday in Corfu? Right? Those questions cannot be answered by lay people, nor can the conclusions of the regulator be parsed by lay people. But what we can hope to parse is the neutrality and good faith of the regulatory exercise. And anyone who pays even cursory attention rapidly concludes that the neutrality and good faith is not there. So I just wrote another book about this that just came out. It's a busy season for me, but it's called How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism. And it digs into this a lot. It came out on 1.0. It's an online book. They're doing a print version in a little while. But it digs into this and it asks, should we believe the people who say that the reason that everyone thinks the earth is flat and vaccines aren't safe and masks don't help and 5G will give you, cancer? Should we believe that that's because big tech developed mind control rays when the best evidence for big tech's mind control rays are the boasts they make to their own customers, whom they're hoping to get advertising dollars out of? Or is there a simpler explanation, right? Is it just that, like, when you own the only place that people go to ask questions, that giving the wrong answer is extremely powerful? And when that's against a backdrop of market concentration that makes people lose faith in the system, then do conspiracies take on this incredible explanatory power?
Mm-hmm. I have my own theory about it, but maybe you can give me your opinion. I'm very interested in the subject of mythology, and I don't think it's dissimilar to religion narrative, religious narratives, Greek mythology, Latin American mythology, pre-colonial stories. All that kind of served a purpose, and one of the purpose was to give an explanation to things that were really complex that we didn't necessarily have the answers to. So all that, for example, in Peru, we had mythology based mostly around the sun god and the moon god, because those were gods that were useful for an mostly agricultural society. So I have this idea that actually the mythology does it helps fill in gap, and there are elements of truth within it. And I see conspiracy theories in the same light, like that there is always some truth to what it's being said, but there are many gaps, and those gaps are filled or connected often the wrong way. So I don't see them as a dissimilar process to building mythology.
I think that's fine. I think that's true. I mean, obviously, like, we need explanations for what goes on in our lives, right? Like, that myths have explanatory power, right? When you look at, like, the enduring myths, they tell you why the sun rises, or spontaneous generation tells you why there's maggots in old meat, or whatever, right? There are all these theories, and they're meant to propose causal relationships in the universe. I mean, an alchemist and a scientist do approximately the same thing, right? They observe two phenomena, hypothesize a causal relationship, do an experiment to test it, and the difference is the alchemist doesn't tell anyone what they think they've learned, which is why all the alchemists ended up drinking mercury, right? Because no one said, hey, you've been kidding yourself, your experiment was stupid, it didn't test what you thought it did, your methodology was crap, and you rounded all your numbers the wrong way because you wanted to be right. That's why we have the method, right? That's the big difference between alchemy and the method, is not like what they do, but what they do after they're done, right? Do they disclose do they show they're working? And do they expose themselves to scrutiny and criticism? And I think that the problem with the big tech made us into conspiracists narrative is that it is an ideological account of what's going on. It suggests that, like, the reason that the flat earth has become more popular now than it has been in hundreds of years is that the arguments of flat earthers are better than they used to be. And either they're better because they are just like these silver-tongued Svengalis who just have, they're just like really good at selling it, or they're better because they've got machine learning, right? Google invented a mind control ray to sell your kids fidget spinners, but then, Robert Mercer hijacked it and gave it to Cambridge Analytica, and they made your uncle a racist, right? And I think that the best evidence we have for machine learning influence campaigns is thin, right? Like, I don't want to say it's impossible, right? Like, there are probably ways that we can influence people with machine learning, with algorithmic techniques, right? Like, I think about the Upworthy headlines. Do you remember 7 incredible ducks that saved their friends? The 8th one is weird, right? And like, for a while, there was a lot of clicking on those headlines, but most stimulus regresses to the mean. Right? So like, yes, obviously advertising works because that's why we do it. But if you look at advertising, you walk around like Brick Lane where they've lovingly preserved all this evidence of the old billboards, that are painted on the sides of these buildings. And they say things like, use Pond's soap, it will get you clean 1 shilling, right? There was a time when you could actually sell soap. And we're in this kind of like limbic arms race where it can get you clean has been replaced by like, use Axe body spray and you will be a love god. Because
hang on, what's that body spray again? I'm just writing that down.
Yeah, I forget what it's called it's called Lynx in the UK. Yeah. It's like we build up a callus, right? And not everyone builds up a callus. If you go to a casino, you'll find people standing in front of the fruit machines wearing adult nappies and, cashing in their kids' university funds. And standing there till they keel over a heart attack, right? But they are like a tiny rump, right? Like in a kind of normal distribution, you will have people who are kind of like 5 sigmas of vulnerability to, some influence campaign, some stimulus, right? People who can't get over it. You see this with addiction. You see it with all kinds of conduct, right? Some people really like horror movies and never get inured to them. And some people really like roller coasters. And some people really can't stop scratching scratch and win cards, right? And that is a problem. When it evinces a pathological response and it hurts people, it's a problem, but it's not a like existential crisis for our society, right? Instead, I think that it's much more likely that for the most part, when they hit on a tactic that works, it only works for a little while, which is why we're not playing Pokemon Go anymore and no one plays Farmville anymore. And neither of those companies have ever had a success afterwards, right? They had, hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on a second act. None of them managed it. What's more likely that they're like super geniuses who have a methodology for reliably producing behavioral influence techniques, or that they just got lucky once and they can't do it again. They just like threw a dart and it landed in a soft spot in our attentional defense system, which rapidly became calloused. And they've been throwing darts ever since. They haven't hit another soft spot. I think that's a more likely account. And the other evidence we have for it, it's things like Google's patent filings. And, maybe to a layperson, a patent filing seems reliable, but especially in the world of software patents, but really in any patent, the structure of a patent filing goes, this is a method by which all things are done with anything. And you hope the patent officer is like, okay, fine, I'll just give you the patent on that. And then the next claim is, this is a slightly narrower method for doing some things with many things, right? And then you finally get down to the actual claim, which is like, you can cut a peanut butter and jelly sandwich diagonally and it's delicious. And that's your final claim. And you hope that the patent examiner is just so like exhausted by reading your garbage novella of legalese that they just give up and they leave some claims in. So Google has filed some bizarre patents, but there's no evidence that they built the things they claim they can build. And then the other evidence is stuff like Facebook did this like non-consensual mass human behavioral modification experiment where they showed get out and vote messages to people on an election day. And they did manage to mobilize a couple 100,000 votes, which is a really big number until you consider that they did it to 20 million people and they had a success rate of less than 0.5%. And again, like there are races where that matters, right? But to say that Facebook has perfected mind control because they've nudged people's conduct by 0.5% on the first go and we don't know if they can repeat the trick, as opposed to Facebook is the kind of company that does mass human experiments without consent, and so they shouldn't be trusted to run a lemonade stand, let alone the socialize with 2.6 billion people. Like, I think that's a much better conclusion, right? That they're just dumb monopolists. Like, the rail barons could predict with 100% accuracy where you would go because they were the ones who decided where the rails went, right? It wasn't because they had a crystal ball. And Facebook can decide what information you'll see, which has a high correlation with the information you believe, because they're the place where we get our information. And, the remedy that we're seeking now in most regulatory fora, especially in the EU, but also in the US increasingly, is to say to Facebook, clean up your act, right? Stop showing people bad information. Do more moderating. And it's like you observe that Mark Zuckerberg is like uniquely unsuited to being in charge of what information 2.6 billion people see, and you tell him to do more of it, right? It's like, and the problem isn't just that he is uniquely unsuited, although boy, is he ever. It's also that nobody is suited to be in charge of the lives of 2.6 billion people. And we have these like absolutely traditional pre-Thatcher, pre-Reagan, pre-Helmut Kohl remedies for this, which is we just say like, you're not allowed to merge with your major competitors. You can't go out and buy WhatsApp to neutralize them as a future competitor. You are not allowed to create vertical monopolies where, you know, you provide both the platform and you compete with the people who use the platform. You know, like that may not solve the whole problem, but as a way of reducing their political power, yeah. Like, so that the next time they're summoned before Parliament, they don't go, yeah, let me look at my calendar. How about never go fuck yourself, right? Like, wouldn't it be nice if they were afraid of Parliament?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is like, I think I've spoken to you about this before, Patricia, but I think you shouldn't be allowed to be anonymous on Twitter or Facebook.
Oh, we've been having this debate. We've been having this debate.
No.
Are you on my side?
I am.
Right, no, I've caught.
No, because my view is that we're going to lose more
Go on.
than what we gain from it. My view is that we gain more by not being afraid of what we say on the internet than what we might win by being polite to everybody.
I mean, here's a totally non-hypothetical example, right? In 2013, the dictator of Cambodia nearly lost what was normally a very easy, like Belarus-style election because of a Facebook-organized resistance. And so he was smart for a dictator. He organized dominance of Facebook. So there are a bunch of things that he does, but the main tactic is that if you don't use your real name on Facebook, because Facebook has a real names policy, he rats you out to Facebook and gets you kicked off the platform so you can't be in the discourse. And if you do use your real name, he sends the police to round you up and beat you and or torture you and murder you, right? So, you know...
That was the simple debunking that I was after, because I knew I was wrong, but I
Also, you know, I mean, I don't know if you've noticed, right? But like, we have named people who are perfectly okay saying some terrible things. Some of them live in Buckingham Palace, right? It's, you know, Prince Andrew does not have to be anonymous to call people racial slurs. He does it in front of Telegraph reporters.
You know, he knows he's never going to jail for anything ever.
I mean, the newspapers say horrible things every day, a lot of which is untrue, and then they apologize for it in a kind of a 1-inch squared area in the corner of a newspaper. The people that I've seen pushing for this are people that I would normally see more benefit in, you know, they have more of an issue with the masses than they do with the corporations and the bad guys that are actually spreading misinformation. That's where kind of the mistrust comes from.
I mean, here's a thing to think about, right? Alan Turing, who makes several appearances in the Little Brother books as a kind of potted histories of him. Quite an amazing, remarkable fellow, invented modern cryptography, helped invent the modern computer, shortened the war by years, saved millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions of lives, was gay. And he was arrested for being gay because it was a felony in living memory to be gay. And then hounded to his death, he killed himself. And in living memory, it was illegal to be gay. It was almost a death sentence if you think about what happened to him. And not just that, it was illegal to have so-called interracial marriage. Smoking cannabis was illegal. It's legal where I live now, taking cannabis in California and in Canada where I'm from. There were a lot of things that are considered not just normal today, but like the prohibition on them is considered to be a stain on our collective moral character, right? A source of shame for us that we ever subjected people to sanction for this conduct. The change did not occur because we non-consensually forced people to reveal every facet of their identity, right? It didn't occur because all of the gay people woke up one morning and said, "Arrest me too, I am Spartacus." Although I have seen that Gladiator movie. It happened because people were able to have conversations in which they chose the time and manner of the disclosure of the true nature of their identity. So, like, it wasn't that you were outed as being gay at the Christmas table, right? Maybe you waited till you and your dad were on a ramble and, really like getting in touch with each other, and you recruited him to be your ally. You told him the true fact of your life that you'd never managed to tell him. One conversation at a time, we built that. So unless you think that in like 2070, your grandkids are going to sit around the table and say, tell me again, Grandpa Chris, how is it that in 2020 we solved all of our social woes and perfected our moral character and haven't had to make any changes? Then you should believe that there are people alive today who you care about, people you love, who have true things about themselves in their heart that they've never revealed to you. They've never been their authentic selves with you. And that if we don't give people a space to have those private conversations, they may never reveal their true selves to you. They may go to their grave with a great sorrow in their hearts from never having been their authentic selves to you, and for you never having known who they were, right? That's why we need a private realm. That's why we need a realm where people can talk. And letting people with heterodox, prohibited ideas find a place to talk to one another does allow people who think that money is spent into existence and taxed out of existence find one another. And it also lets people who want to carry tiki torches through the streets of Charlottesville chanting "Jews will not replace us" find each other. And the latter have some very powerful allies who will find ways to overcome the transaction costs of networking if we take away anonymity that lowers those transaction costs. But who is going to pay for you to find your allies? If being a heterodox economist who's toying with MMT in your freshman year at the University of Chicago immediately gets you outed to the whole world, and they bring out the robot of Milton Friedman to come and like ritually beat you in the quad, We don't have corporate sponsorship, I'm afraid, so we're on our own.
A good point. Well made. So back to Attack Surface for a second. There's a bit of dialogue from Tanisha about Wikipedia. They're talking tactics, and Tanisha's the BLM activist. Wikipedia, that dumps a whitewash. The Red Pill Bros and the Blue Lives Matter folks have figured out that brigading Wikipedia gets them better bang for their buck than hitting social media. Tell us about how that works.
Well, I don't know that it's true now, but it's certainly something that we've seen a lot of, right? I mean, I'm actually quite a booster of Wikipedia, but this idea that you can brigade an article, and I haven't looked at the MMT article, maybe you've had direct experience of it, but this idea that you can brigade an article, that you can play rules lawyer and do this kind of bad faith, high volume redefinition of an authoritative source is very powerful and very tempting. I mean, it is one of the things that makes Wikipedia somewhat stagnant now, is they have had to take such extreme measures to prevent that kind of gamesmanship that they have made it hard for everyday participants to weigh in. It's actually really hard to edit Wikipedia these days because there's a lot of niceties that you have to master. And it's become a problem because it's excluding traditionally marginalized people from working on those entries. But yeah, we've seen it successfully in the past, right? And sometimes in a very targeted way, very briefly. And sometimes when there's a scandal, like in Canada, there's a scandal around a charity called We Charity that was started by a young activist at the time who wanted to end child slavery, but which turned into this multi-million-dollar enterprise run by this person who's now an adult, and which has been embroiled in all kinds of scandal, including like doing corporate tie-ups to sell products made by child slaves to benefit the charity, but also like paying the prime minister's family hundreds of thousands of dollars in improperly dispersed funds from the charity and so on. They've prorogued Parliament in Canada over this to stop the investigation.
Wow.
And one of the things that arose when this was coming out, when the scandal was breaking, and, back to anonymity, one of the reasons that we learned as much as we did about them is because of anonymous whistleblowers. But one of the things that happened is that we learned a lot about the whitewashing of the Wikipedia entries, right? That the Wikipedia entries were extremely rosy about them. For them, there was an even more insidious thing, which is that they had media partnerships with all the major outlets in Canada. So the outlets were unwilling to cover or investigate them when they got tips. And so all the authoritative material you could source in an article about the We Charity came from press that was very friendly to the We Charity. And so you ended up with these entries that were very, very, very glowing, And I'm not saying that there is necessarily a conspiracy to do it. In my opinion, it looks dodgy, right? And you know, it is the kind of thing that you see reputation laundering companies engage in and so on.
Well, did you follow the story? It probably peaked in 2018 about the Wikipedia editor account that called itself Philip Cross.
Oh, that rings a bell.
Craig Murray wrote a lot about it, who's now covering the Assange quote-unquote trial.
Right.
Yeah, he's a sort of ex-diplomat. So this account called Philip Cross, you know, exclusively edits pages of people like John Pilger and Noam Chomsky and Media Lens and any kind of dissident thing, pretty much in parallel with what Oliver Cam thinks, who's kind of a bit of a right-wing nut job. And people looked into the edit history, and basically it's either a person that starts work at 8 a.m. and finishes work at 10 p.m. because he's editing that all day, 7 days a week.
Wow.
Without a day off for 5 years.
Wow.
It's either that.
One person or a team.
And it basically had a very exclusive right-wing bias to it. I couldn't believe there wasn't more fuss made about it. In fact, somebody made a Wikipedia page about Philip Cross. Well, quote, Philip Cross got removed. You know.
Wow. I mean, you know, don't discount the possibility that it's one obsessive weirdo, but it also, that does seem highly suspicious for sure.
That was Craig Murray's conclusion. He said, "Yeah, we shouldn't discount that it could.
Right, it's
within the realm of possibility." But
I mean, to bring this back to econ,
sorry.
I have friends who worked on EverQuest, which was one of the first massively multiplayer online games, and they decided to create these rough equilibria by way of an economy. So one of the tasks that you could do to acquire in-game wealth and skill was shear sheep and then craft the wool into jumpers. And there was an equilibrium between the number of jumpers and the number of sheep. When you wore a jumper, it wore out over time, and then a new sheep would appear when the jumper disappeared. And all of the sheep disappeared. And it turned out that there was one guy who just made jumpers but never wore them or sold them, and he had used up all of the sheep. So people do weird things with computers.
Yes, they do.
I mean, he liked clicking on knitting needles. He didn't actually like knitting. He liked clicking on the knitting interface.
So let's steer it into econ now then. A couple of things from Attack Surface. I made a note to ask you about this. Tell us about hyperbolic discounting.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of like behavior-econ in the book, and it's this idea that we discount things that are far away, which, you know, fair enough, right? The feast that you promised me in a week doesn't mean that I'm willing to fast between now and then, right? The value of the food, even low-quality food right away, is still high. But we over-discount it, right? We hyperbolically discount it. And this is a common problem in privacy where we assume that the fallout from a privacy disclosure is going to be smaller than we rationally should anticipate it being. And this is, of course, compounded by the fact that even a rational lay understanding of the true cost of a privacy disclosure probably is too low to begin with, right? That there are these unquantifiable risks in privacy disclosures. So say like the NHS decides to release an anonymized data set that has, which doctor wrote which prescription at what time in what hospital, and a random identifier for each patient, so that researchers can go in and go, oh, well, men who get erectile dysfunction medication go on statins 5% faster than men who don't, right? That's the kind of thing where these big data sets are super useful for. So that seems like on its face to be a pretty safe data set to release. But then say Addison Lee has a breach, and now you know who went to the hospital just before each of those scripts were written. Well, the NHS can't anticipate Addison Lee's breach, right? It's not even like they had a planned release. They just, some company that does hire cars or minicabs just like didn't secure its IT very well. And like no language on earth contains the phrase as good as the IT security at a minicab stand, right? So, now you can reconnect, right? You can re-identify this de-identified set in large part. And maybe the risks from that are things like an abusive father finds out that his daughter is on birth control pills, or somebody who is transitioning, who hasn't outed themselves to their family, has that revealed, or somebody whose career depends on them being in good health has been hiding the fact of their cancer from their colleagues. And now the fact that they're getting cancer meds is in the public domain. So it's very hard for the NHS to know what that risk is going to be at the outset. And it's very hard for you when you give that data, when you take a cab with Addison Lee to the hospital to see your doctor, it's very hard for you to anticipate that someday that record will leak and be cross-confirmed with a planned release of data from the NHS, right? And so not only do we underestimate what it's worth, what the possible risks are, but we also underprice the risks that we know about. And we say, well, what's the big deal? What's the worst that can happen?
Okay, got it. And then the other one that came up was liquidity provision algorithms.
Yeah.
That sounds sexy. Yeah. Let's get in there.
Yeah. The last lecture I gave before I left London in 2015 was to some really lovely people. I don't want them to feel like I'm speaking ill of them. I really enjoyed their company, who were city boys. And they made liquidity provision algorithms. And what these were bots that if you were like, so actually it's a really good example because it's coming up now. It seems pretty likely that Tesla is going to join the S&P 500 at some point soon, although it's not 100% sure. It may be that their stock rally was driven by some fraud from SoftBank. But once Tesla hits the S&P 500, all of the spread bet retirement funds, Vanguard and so on, are going to have to buy a bunch of Tesla. Right? And so there are a ton of companies that are taking positions in Tesla in the anticipation that there will be a high demand for Tesla once it hits the S&P 500. And this is, of course, driving a share price higher and getting into the S&P 500. And you might not want to advertise that fact, right? You might want to hide the fact that, say it's a month ago and it's not clear that Tesla is headed for the S&P 500. You might decide, okay, I'm going to speculatively start quietly buying up a lot of Tesla shares on the off chance that it looks like they're headed for the S&P 500, at which point people will head for it. What I don't want to do is drive the price up while I'm doing it. So I'm going to write a bot, a set of scripts that spread out the purchases to make them seem random, to make them seem not just random, but like normal, right? To raise the noise floor on the signal so that it just looks like it's within the acceptable margin of normal activity for trading on this share, so that the other bots that buy these shares, that look for this kind of activity and snap the shares up to drive the price up before whoever is buying them can do it. So the people are trying to front running those other people are front running those other people, so they don't figure out what I'm up to. And so you have bot masters versus bot masters, people writing algorithms, pitting their wits against people writing algorithms. People writing algorithms that fake out other algorithms, like to make it look like maybe you're taking a big position to get the algorithm to tie up all its liquid capital in some other share so that you can swoop in and buy the share you're really after, and so on. And the part that I just found incredibly depressing about all of this, it was, again, these guys were absolutely lovely. And I went in and they said, we've got this very diverse workplace. We're all Cambridge physics PhDs, but that guy over there is an Oxford PhD in physics. Which, very funny, but
it's the whole spectrum.
The whole spectrum, country and Western. But they had gotten this incredible education at public expense, right? Obviously, this was before the Lib Dems sold us out on tuition, but even then, grad school was free, right? So they'd attained this top-notch education at public expense. And they had mobilized it in service of the most socially useless labor imaginable. I mean, it wasn't even like they were publishing on it, right? Because it had to be a secret. So it wasn't like they were advancing our understanding of statistics and cryptography and, signal detection. They were not adding anything even to our store of knowledge, because I'm all for like pure research. I don't think that's socially useless. But pure research that's alchemy, pure research where you don't publish at the end, and then it's in service to allowing, the Sultan of Brunei to buy another aircraft carrier to put yet another car collection on. The first one that he put on an aircraft carrier didn't reckon with the salt damage, and he had to dump the cars into the sea. So I understand he's amassing another rare car collection. So maybe he gets a better aircraft carrier with a salt-proof bubble over the deck so he can keep his cars on that.
Well, that just goes to show there are pros and cons to going to Cambridge, though, isn't it? I mean,
yeah. Well, on the plus side, maybe you join the Footlight Society. On the negative side,
you do socially useless stuff,
right? Or you have to go to school with someone who joins the Bullingdon Club or something.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Oh, that's a big con.
Michael Gove is your dorm mate. Michael Gove is in charge of your dorm.
Oh, God.
That's the world we're living in now. Oh, my God. So this is the first interview that we've done since the tragic news of David Graeber's untimely death. And you wrote some lovely stuff about David this week. Do you want to say something about your thoughts about David and the impact that he had with debt?
Yeah, I mean, debt completely changed so many people's thinking. And it really epitomized his ability to both cross disciplines within the academy. You know, he was an anthropologist writing about economics, and not only was he an anthropologist writing about how the economy works, but he was an anthropologist who was doing ethnographies of economists. Why are economists wrong, right? Like, what is it about their social relations that rewards this specific kind of wrongness? And so, yeah, he had this cross-disciplinary insight, which is, you know, great. It's dialectic, whatever. But he also had a cross-modal ability where he could talk both to academics and to a lay audience. And, you know, it wasn't just coining, I think he coined the slogan, "We are the 99%, right? But it was also the way he mobilized slogans like that in a heftier, synthetic, you know, insightful, but also always witty, always funny way. And, you know, I first encountered debt. I went to my editor's house in Brooklyn, science fiction editor, really great guy, very eclectic, self-taught, dropped out of school at 14 to be a professional science fiction fan and sleep on people's sofas around the country, writing fanzines and going to cons. Now is a vice president of Macmillan and the co-publisher of Tor Books. And he's always got amazing recommendations. And he was like, "Have you heard of this book, Debt?" And he shoved it in my hand, you know, this brick of a book. And I was like, "God, don't ask me to read a brick. I've got 50 books I want to blurb. How can I read this?" And I started reading it and I couldn't put it down. And then the next thing I saw, Jo Walton, who's this incredibly intellectually curious, brilliant science fiction and fantasy writer, she's Welsh but lives in Montreal, was writing nonfiction articles for science fiction websites about debt and about what it says about the economics of genre, both the economy of the genre and the economics within genre stories. And then my pal and collaborator, Charlie Strauss, who's a writer who lives in Scotland, wrote a book, Saturn's Children, that is a version of Debt. It's a fictional space opera version of Debt that takes place over tens of thousands of years. It's this very audacious book.
Wow.
And then I wrote a book that was based on Debt. I wrote Walk Away, which is a kind of mashup of Debt and Rebecca Solnit's Paradise Built in Hell. And you know, you see these sprinklings of David's thinking everywhere, but I think that it was Bullshit Jobs that really made him, you know, made his bones, right? It's where he, as the sociologists say, where he breached, where he came into a much wider public eye. And I think in part because it's a short book.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, Debt's amazing, but it's you know, it sits next on my shelf. Well, no, it sits under a table leg with Capital in the 21st Century as a useful step stool. But Bullshit Jobs struck such a chord, right? And it could have been such a trivial book because it started as an article he wrote where he said, "I think most jobs are bullshit. Most people are just, you know, apple polishers for petty empire builders in large firms." And then he got this, you know, whack of email from people going, "Oh yeah, no, my job's totally bullshit." And it could have just been like people moaning about their stupid jobs. And instead it was this like incredibly incisive critique of the notion of work itself, which, you know, I've yet to see anyone well square with like the jobs guarantee, right? I would love to see someone have an anti-bullshit jobs guarantee synthesis. I don't think it's impossible, but no one's done it.
I think that should be the basic requirement. It should be
not bullshit.
Anti-bullshit, yeah.
Yeah.
The anti-bullshit job guarantee.
But, you know, I mean, Pavlina's got a good line on this. I talked to her about it for the LA Times, but, you know, I think the great weakness of the job guarantee, it's in the novel I'm working on. I'm writing this post-GND utopian novel about truth and reconciliation with white nationalist militias. And the militias have got it all wired. What they do is they pack the city council meetings in the same way that People Brigade Wikipedia entries. And they just say all of the jobs should be apportioned to people who are like in charge of playing cards at the MAGA club. And then they all get paid to sit around at the MAGA club being racist at one another. And they just do it by like being better at the boring bureaucracy, at like waiting out the meeting till 1 a.m. and then calling the question, that kind of thing. Anyone who's ever been at like a Revolutionary Workers' Party meeting knows what this looks like too, right? It's not a unique characteristic of the right. This kind of like, people who are in like the fifth or sixth limbic sigma in their ability to tolerate boredom and procedure have this fantastic advantage, right? The lawyer who can read an 8,000-page contract and find the clause in it, and the lawyer who can write that contract and hide a clause in it are in some ways the secret legislators of the world.
Right, yeah.
And so, yeah, I'd love to see someone square that up. And he was just charming.
Right, yeah. I was going to say, I think this is the reason why, say, Warren Mosler, when you start talking about job guarantee, people go, well, what are people going to be doing? Mm-hmm. And Warren Mosler kind of goes, I wouldn't answer that question with, there's all kinds of stuff people can do. I would answer that question with, they're going to be transitioning to a job in the private sector. So we're going to assume the public sector is as big as it wants to be right now. That the government's hired everybody that it needs to hire.
Yeah.
The private sector's hired everybody they need to hire. So, obviously if the government wants to expand, it will, right? So we've presumed that it's where it is.
Right.
So the idea is, when you're unemployed, you are supposedly looking for private sector work.
Right.
And so this is like you're transitioning to private sector work without the having to sit at home and have a miserable life type thing. So either way, you could have that transition happen by having the miserable life and not being paid enough to actually live on, which is an interesting challenge if you like a challenge. Mm-hmm. or you could have a job. Only the government's going to do it in a way that guarantees 100% of the people that want to work get a job. I know that people do go, no, I want specifics, but I'm just saying that's why he steers it that way, I think.
No, I was just going to add that I do think that the quality of the jobs and ultimately will reflect the quality of the job guarantee, and that is in turn reflected by the quality of the institutions that enable it. We have this idea of centrally funded, locally administered, but local administrations can vary a lot in quality, in transparency, in bureaucracy. And people who can play the system will obviously benefit more than people that are not very savvy in it. And that's just going to happen. And there's going to be a lot of things to iron out.
Sure. You're bringing up the last discussion stroke argument I ever had with David. We did a little video TV show thing early on in the plague months called Spectre, which they finally just put on YouTube kind of in memoriam. I think they just hadn't gotten around to it. It was like a live stream when they aired it. But David was talking about bullshit jobs and abolishing work. And I said the thing that I said, I think the last time I was on this program, which was that we probably have 300 or 400 years worth of full-time employment for every person who will be born doing things about climate change, relocating all of our cities 20 kilometers inland, dealing with hundreds of millions of traumatized refugees, managing the inevitable future pandemics, dealing with the mass wildfires, dealing with the floods, and so on, right? Retooling the entire agricultural sector as we lose arable land. Some of that is skilled labor. A lot of that is medium skilled labor you could train for pretty quickly. And figuring out how we can have a legitimate system whereby we create those jobs and make sure that they're the jobs that we need and that it's not coercive, that people aren't being forced into them, and that they see a reason to do them, that they feel that they're part of a great work that needs doing, that, all of that stuff. I mean, the tagline in the novel I'm working on now is people have been told and have come to believe that they're the first generation in a century not to fear the future. And so that's why they get up every morning and help relocate cities and deal with traumatized refugees and do all the other things that they're doing. It's a thing they wrestle with because they're quite afraid. They all feel like they're imposters because they're not supposed to be afraid. But the time the fear goes away is when they do the work. Figuring out how to kind of make that happen is, it's going to be like a real institutional challenge. And my fear is that it's very easily spoiled, that it's a system that is fragile and brittle, and that bad faith actors can readily disrupt it.
Sure, yeah.
I think that's a real concern.
I think I go to, look, it only has to be better than the dole, because that's what it's supposed to be.
Oh, not if we're going to save the planet. Not if we're going to save the planet. The stakes matter, right?
Oh, yeah.
This is where I argued with David, is I don't think that if you replace bullshit jobs with play, that it ends well, because I think we don't have any... Well, I mean, yes, we should all play. But but I don't think we have any slack in the system.
Sure,
I think we're going to drown and burn and die of pandemics if we don't get our shit together and start doing stuff.
But again, I think what Mosler is saying is if those jobs are as serious as you're talking about, Cory, which they are, I agree they are, they should be in the government's budget, not the job guarantee. We're not just going to basically, at the moment, the way we do unemployment now is the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, is 5%.
Yeah,
they say that. Sometimes they get it down to 4 or something like that.
Right.
What they're saying is that the working buffer stock, the job guarantee people, is a more liquid buffer stock. So you'd be able to have it at 2%.
Right.
It's opening up capacity in that way, not necessarily the jobs themselves, but what the scheme is enabling, that people can more quickly get into that workforce, when they're needed. Because the only other alternative is to spend too much, quote unquote, too much, and just live in a permanently inflationary environment.
Yeah.
So that's why you need a buffer stock.
Well, yeah.
So I always lean into the macro of it rather than the jobs, but the jobs are important. But
a narrative I've heard about this that I found compelling came from the Trash Future podcast, which is kind of dirtbag left British, great podcast. And they talked about how after the pandemic, if 30% of people are unemployed, or are in government employment schemes, whether that's a job guarantee, I know the job guarantee is not a scheme, but whatever, then the life of people in society will be completely divorced from the finance sector. Literally what happens to the market will not matter in any way. It won't affect your pension. It won't affect what you can buy. It won't affect what you can sell. It won't affect your wage. It won't affect your kids. It won't affect your parents. You are just going to be it's just going to be a complete irrelevance to you. And then city boys will go back to being what they were, in Mary Poppins, which is the slightly dull-witted bean counters who get to go home every day at 5 o'clock and get 5 weeks of holiday, have no ambitions to run the world. The son you would have sent to the priesthood in the age of primogeniture now puts on a bowler hat and goes to the square mile every morning and does work of equal social utility.
And those smart people can go back to doing physics again and
That's right.
And figuring out the real world problems that we need to solve.
Calculating spherical cows on frictionless surfaces.
I do like this idea. I mean, Fadel Kabib talks about a green jobs guarantee, right? And I think the idea is that if big infrastructure projects that are aimed at tackling climate change are so important that they should go on the central plan, it should be a proper permanent job. But the issue with the job guarantee, one of the benefits it has, I think, is that because it's locally administered, therefore the local authorities may be able to address problems that are not necessarily seen by the central government that are specific to the area. For example, certain areas here may have areas that are prone to flooding or areas that, have a lot of allotments and that is important for them to keep them working well for the population. Right. And so these things that are specific to each area, I think would likely end up being part of one of the main things that are tackled in a job guarantee, things that are very specific to the area that the central government just can't look at easily or can't identify easily or understand even.
Sure.
But at the same time, that are classed as green jobs and as part of in a small scale, the Green New Deal.
Yeah, I mean, there's a funny confluence of Hayek and Marx here, right? Because Hayek is we can't use central government because there's a lot of information dispersed that can only be aggregated by markets. People at the coalface know what they want. People in the center don't. And Marx is and your boss shouldn't be in charge of what you're doing because the person operating the machine knows more about what needs doing than the boss, right? They there is a weird way in which they agree with one another.
Yeah, and in a way, the only reason the central government's in it, which is right at the heart of MMT, is that's the only entity that can't run out of money.
Right.
Otherwise, it wouldn't even be there.
Right.
It would all be local. So, in fact, we did an episode with Vincent Huang, who is a Chinese economist or Chinese-born.
I heard that episode.
It is a bit more like that in China. His job guarantee proposal is about the municipalities because they are able to run deficits in the municipalities. So it is a lot easier to get that going on.
Did you see Michael Hudson's piece on debt and China and the crisis, where he's Chinese banks are all state banks. And so they just effectively declared a jubilee, right? That debts that can't be paid won't be paid.
Yeah.
And so, just like mortgages and corporate, infrastructure debt and whatever, they just wipe it off the books because they can, because they're the government. And that way firms can continue to operate, right? They can mothball themselves and come back, a bit like the Danes did where they socialized payrolls, or to a lesser extent the UK and Canada. But they went much further, and it's given them a great deal of resilience relative to, say, the US, where we're seeing just a devastating wave of bankruptcies in SMEs, to say nothing of individual bankruptcies. And of course, one follows the other, and we're having an epidemic of evictions now. And I live in a neighborhood in Burbank that sells at a premium because it's got such a dinky high street. It's, full of very distinctive independent shops, I don't know, like Marylebone Road or Marylebone High Street or something. And they're all empty storefronts now because those firms couldn't last. And many of them had undergone a lot of stress prior to the crisis because the landlords are all entering their second generation. So the first generation invested in the neighborhood, bought these storefronts, extracted modest rents in order to, work in partnership with their tenants. And then they died and their kids were just like, I just want some money, right? And so they jacked up everyone's rent and people couldn't afford it, got turfed out for large multinational firms who were the first ones to declare that they wouldn't pay rent after the crisis hit because they had the muscle. And so now you see this like 1-2 punch of large firms not paying rent because they don't have to, and small firms not paying rent because they can't, and the whole street is just shutting down, and I don't know what'll be left of it when it's all over.
Yeah, we had Alan Sugar declaring today that his commercial properties were suffering as a result of the
Oh my goodness.
I know. So he wanted us all at work, obviously, because he's concerned about
Right. Well, nobody think of the Pret.
I'm just looking for my tiny violin. I've seemed to have lost it again.
You're recalling my conversation with David now. We were talking on that TV show. We said if a billionaire needs you to go to work so he can make billions, then the source of his billions was always you.
Of course, yeah.
Right.
So,
we should talk about Mexico. So, Mexico entered into a new trade agreement with Canada and the U.S., the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, when Trump tore up NAFTA. And one of the things we see in trade agreements is a requirement to update your copyright laws to they call it harmonizing, but it's never harmonized. It's always harmonizing upwards. So the weakest partner in the transaction is always required to enact more strict copyright, patent, and related rights so that multinational firms who are the primary holders of these rights will be able to exercise them more thoroughly. And true to form, on July the 1st, the Mexican Congress, without any meaningful debate or consultation, basically pasted in the U.S. Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998, along with the EU's filter mandate from last March from the Copyright Directive, and did not include even the minimal safeguards in those two regimes. But there's this like circuit breaker built into Mexican law, which is that the Human Rights Commission, which is nominally independent, although I mentioned that on Twitter this morning and someone said, well, they're not that independent because their offices are currently being occupied by activists who are aghast at their inaction on other issues. But the Human Rights Commission has 30 days after the law is passed by the Congress to refer to the Supreme Court for adjudication as to whether it's constitutional and whether it violates human rights. And a group of activists, including the Electronic Frontier Foundation, for whom I'm a consultant, Red Mexico, R3D Mexico, Derechos Digitales, Creative Commons Mexico, and so on, pressurized the Human Rights Commission, which did refer to the Supreme Court. It is before the Congress this week, and it is going before the Supreme Court very shortly. And some EFF lawyers are testifying this week in front of the Congress. So it's really quite a remarkable thing, and it might sound very anodyne, but the copyright law they've brought in allows multinational firms not just to do the things we talked about earlier in the DRM segment, decide what a family is and so on, but also block right to repair and also block free expression. So the free expression guarantees in the Mexican Constitution are trammeled by digital locks. If the digital lock doesn't let you do the thing the Constitution says you have the right to, you can't remove the lock to do it, even if no copyright is violated. And really importantly, the rules that Mexico has adopted are far less favorable to the Mexican people and firms operating in Mexico than the Canadian and U.S. versions. And so Canadian and U.S. firms can play regulatory arbitrage to extract higher rents from Mexican people than they can at home in the U.S. and Canada because Mexican people are deprived of some of the freedoms that they would have had. And then Mexican firms that might want to compete with them, SMEs that might want to, for example, make an interoperable product, are prohibited from doing so if they have to bypass a digital lock. So if you're a Mexican ink cartridge refiller for an inkjet printer, bypassing the digital lock to get the ink cartridge to work is a crime now in Mexico. And so HP, this multinational, which nominally is a California company, I think, like it maintains the accounting fiction that all of its money is in orbit around the Irish Sea. But this American firm gets to extract prices for ink that rival vintage Veuve Clicquot from Mexicans, and Mexican firms can't start rivals that act as a competitive hedge against this by making cheaper remanufactured ink cartridges without violating copyright law. And what copyright is violated when you refill an ink cartridge, right? There's no such thing as copyrighted ink. But because you have to bypass a digital lock to get the cartridge to recognize the new fluid in it, and the digital lock can't be removed without violating this copyright law, you commit felonies when you traffic in the tools to allow people to do that.
These cartridges are expensive in the UK. In Peru, they're prohibitive. So it's common for people to go to secondhand providers and cheaper providers to be able to make these manageable. I can imagine in Mexico that it would just up the cost of everything so much, and for the sake of profit for HP, right?
God, these backstreet printers.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that, and it's worse. You're right that it will make it prohibitive. This also applies, though, to the agricultural sector. So fixing your own tractor becomes illegal, but also adapting technology for local use becomes illegal. John Deere is very infamous for opposing right to repair and saying farmers shouldn't be allowed to modify their tractors. But when you look at John Deere's own history, all of the patents they filed in their early years were inventions that they gathered. They sent effectively field engineers to farmers' farms to see how the farmers had adapted their industrial equipment for their local circumstance. And so you have, this idea of precision agriculture that's being managed out of the global north by people whose experiences are completely unlike the experiences of people in the global south. Like, what do you do if your tractor needs a software update, but the narcos have taken over the mobile network that day, right? And there's a hailstorm coming for your fields. This is not a circumstance that is in the top of mind for engineers in a Mountain View boardroom doing feature planning and failure mode anticipation for their tractors. So this whole idea of self-determination and national sovereignty just goes out the window straight away. And then the last problem is that, as you say, no one can afford the ink and people will still fix their tractors. And so now you have the possibility of highly selective enforcement. And this is especially a problem in countries where you have governments that either centrally or in the outlying areas are corrupt or in other ways have their fingers on the scale for one side or the other in industrial political outcomes. So, after Russia acceded to the WTO, one of the things they enacted was this idea of effectively the presumption of guilt for copyright infringement. If you had a software work, right, if you had a copy of Windows, it was on you to prove that it was a real copy of Windows. Otherwise, you were presumed guilty. And of course, everyone's got Windows and most people have pirated it in Russia, whatever, right? But democratic opposition newspapers were the ones who were preferentially rated, and not for publishing seditious material, but for having pirated copies of Windows. And everything they offered, well, I've got the hologram on the box. Holograms can be faked. I have the serial number. Serial numbers can be faked. Was just dismissed, and their computers were rounded up, seized. Their confidential sources were revealed. The whole operations ground to a halt. And it was really critical to the consolidation of power in Russia after the WTO accession. And, I think relatively well of AMLO, the leader of Mexico right now. But Mexico has not been a paragon of good governance in recent years. They've had some breathtakingly corrupt both state and national governments, as well as police forces. And the idea that everyone is presumptively guilty of a felony means that you can engage in this kind of selective enforcement and just shut down firms, target individuals, and engage in harassment without ever making it look like you are doing the totalitarian thing.
Okay. To what extent, to what extent is this an attempt as well as making it as difficult as possible for the global south to develop their own kind of technology and basically to challenge the monopolies from the US.
Well, I think that it's not just the global south, right? It's about stopping everyone, including firms in the global north. I mean, I don't think that like PE or VC firms in the global north have a stake in protecting Facebook. That's not why they're not investing in Facebook. They're not investing in Facebook because they're scared because Facebook has all these anti-competitive ways of crushing any firm that they start. That's why they call all the businesses that Facebook is in, they call it the kill zone, and no one will invest in it. Yeah, they absolutely do not want the global south to challenge them either. And, you know, you could do worse than to just look at the history of the U.S. as a developing nation, where in its early years, it didn't honor British patents or copyrights or other foreign patents or copyrights. Famously, Dickens used to have to tour America to make money because people didn't have to pay for his books there. And it was because they were a post-colonial nation, right, that most of their so-called intellectual property, their patents and copyrights, were owned by British firms and by British individuals. And it wasn't until they became a net exporter of copyrights and patents that they sought out bilateral agreements with the powers that were importing American copyrights and patents that would offer like a mutual respect of one another's rights. And, you know, that is definitely a part of the U.S. pattern to prohibit foreign parties, developing nations who are in a weaker negotiating position from repeating their trick. In fact, I think there's a way that you can look at the whole globalist integration of China, the normalization of relations with China, as a bet on that, right? When you look at the way that neoliberals talked about China in the early WTO days, what they said was, we are going to retain the intellectual property and China will do the work. And we will extract rent from, like, we will interpose ourselves in every transaction, right? That we will have patents, copyrights, trademarks, and neighboring rights that will allow us to ensure that everything made in China has to pay toll to us. And so we get the best of all worlds, right? We don't have to have the dark satanic mills on our doorstep, but we can still have the great top hats, you know, the dark satanic mills allow us to afford, because they will have to pay rent to us, not on space, which we would after all have to then maintain and prevent people from gathering at the factory gates to demand better wages and so on, but on ideas, which, you know, we will enforce through a trade court. And of course that bet was always stupid, right? It wasn't like China was going to be like, oh, you got us, we signed the agreement, I guess we're just going to pay you rent from now on. Dag nabbit, why didn't we see that one coming? Right? Like, of course they were going to steal all the copyrights and patents just like America did. Who wouldn't do it? I mean, if you think Jean Valjean was okay stealing a loaf of bread, then surely, you know, Huawei taking all of Nortel's trade secrets is okay too.
I'm not putting up with your imperialist stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to round off, back to Attack Surface, which we'll link to all the links about Attack Surface.
Sure.
But in the afterword, you write, to make lasting structural changes, you need to use technology to change politics. And I think you always leave your readers with hope when you finish a book. The future's not set, it's dynamic, we've got choices. What gives you hope today?
Well, I think that, and I may have mentioned this on the last one, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. But the thing that gives me hope is that we are at a moment in which we could have a great awakening of a sense of shared, not shared destiny, but shared trauma, right? That all of the people who are angry about climate change understand that in part the reason that we have inaction on climate change is that the highly concentrated energy sector is able to extract monopoly rents and come to a consensus position on policy that allows them to dictate what happens and ensure that there's no action. And the people who are worried about labor markets understand that the highly concentrated labor market has exactly the same problem. And the people who are worried about tech monopolies understand this about big tech. And the people who are worried about textiles understand it about big textile. And the people who understand it about, who are worried about publishing understand it about publishing, and so on. And that the thing that we all have the power to realize, that we are all so close to understanding, is that all of these things are aspects of monopoly and competition and self-determination and pluralism, that they are a common foe with a common solution. And, you know, Jamie Boyle, the copyright scholar, he talks about how before the term ecology was coined, there were people who cared about owls, and then there were people who cared about the ozone layer, and they didn't know that they were on the same side. They thought, oh yeah, I like what you're doing, but it's not my issue. What they had was 1,000 issues. But the term ecology turned that into one movement with 1,000 ways to get involved. And that's what gives me hope, right? That we're at this understanding that hegemony, oligarchy, bad policy outcomes, what we sometimes call conspiracy and sometimes call corruption, opioid epidemics, and the fact that there's only one pro wrestling league and all the wrestlers have been reclassified as contractors and they don't have medical insurance and they're begging on GoFundMe to die with dignity of work-related injuries in their 50s. These are all reflections of the same underlying pathology, right? That they are all reflections of the abandonment 40 years ago of common sense anti-monopoly rules, like not allowing major firms to merge, not allowing large firms to buy new firms to prevent them growing into competitive threats, and not allowing firms to create vertical monopolies where they have a platform and then they compete with the people who use the platform. And there's lots of work at the margins. There's lots of devil in the details. But those three bedrock principles, no merging with major competitors, no anti-competitive acquisitions, no vertical monopolies, those are things that we have in our power to create. We're not like a fallen civilization that has forgotten how to build the pyramids, right? We still have the statute books from before Thatcher and Reagan and Mulroney and Pinochet and Helmut Kohl tore them up. We can just paste the text back in. In fact, in many cases, they didn't even alter the statutes. They just told their justice ministries to stop enforcing them, right? We still have the precedents. We still have the whole thing, and it's all in living memory, and we could change it tomorrow on a dime. And that's the thing that gives me hope.
I do think that for people to understand all the complexities you've just described, we're going to need more great communicators like David Graeber and like yourself, Cory.
Oh, I'm but an egg. David was he was so charming, even when he disagreed with you, and funny and acerbic.
Yeah, it is such a shame. It is such a shame.
Yeah. I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
Kickstarter is doing well. We've sold 2,100 units for $81,852. Remember that my goal is 10,000 units. It's not so much the dollars that matter as the number of units sold. So if anyone is listening to this and wants to help me challenge the hegemony of big electronic publishing platforms and convince publishers to let their authors to do pre-sales of electronic titles independently, this is the place to go. Just put my name in Kickstarter into your search engine. I understand Alta Vista operates a very good one. Okay. And off you go.
Alta Vista. So, and what's the lowest pledge level on your Kickstarter?
Well, I think for $15 you can get the audiobook. There's a $1, just support it pledge, but for $15 you get the item. Correct. So that's the lowest item. And so $15, which is, I forget which way the pound is moving this week. It's sort of a race, right? To see whose economy is worse. Well, but on the dollar, surely the dollar is declining too. I know that
we're declining faster. I think that's
really. Oh my God.
It's no deal Brexit. It's no deal Brexit threat.
No deal Brexit. Yeah. You're right. I forgot about no deal. Everything else is on fire, and I forgot about no deal Brexit.
It's the least of our problems at this point, I think.
The Tories have in fact managed to make Brexit less of a problem. They figured out how to make Brexit the thing that British people don't have to worry about as much as anything else.
Oh my God, I can't believe we've ended on that.
That's what they teach you in the Bullingdon Club. Are you angry because we're being too loud in your restaurant? What if we were to smash the plate glass window?
Oh, excellent.
All right, guys.
All right, well, it's great to talk to you, Cory.
Wash your hands, wear a mask.
Good luck with everything, Cory.
All right, talk to you later.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
That was the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT Podcast And you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Editing and post-production was by Damien Caldwell. Thanks for listening.